And now we're going to go through very quickly each of the media types we're going to be studying this term, starting with out-of-home. This is an out-of-home poster, a bill that was posted, not actually in the U.S., but in Britain, advertising the Virginia colony. And so this piece of paper would have been printed on a movable type printing press on one page, and then people would be paid to run around London with a bunch of these bills with a bucket of glue and a brush, and they would put them up where they could. They were accepted places where you could post announcements and things and ads, and that's what people did. So you can see here that I think there was a program. Was it on Netflix? I can't remember. There was a series about Roanoke, I think, and the Virginia colony, and that's what this is. So printed for Samuel Matcham and are to be sold at his shop in Paul's Churchyard at the sign of the Bullhead. So excellent fruits by planting in Virginia, exciting all such as will be affected to further the same. New Britannia, Nova Britannia is what they called our country in those days. Of course, there were a lot of people who were here before the Europeans. I hasten to point out, importantly, who had a pretty cool country and pretty cool things going on long before any Europeans came over. But that is the subject of another class. Here, galloping several hundred years ahead, but not that different in terms of technology and the basic medium, is a poster from World War I. This again is one piece of paper with glue that was put up in different places in a city, encouraging young men primarily to enlist in the Army, in the U.S. Army, to fight the mad, brute militarism and to go fight in Europe for World War I. I will say that this is also, I think, an example of a very effective poster. And a lot of these turn of the century, early 20th century posters are really quite beautiful. The art direction, the level of talent in these items is really quite amazing. So this is one of these kind of beautiful early 20th century posters. Here, maybe not so beautiful, but maybe this is from 20 or 30 years ago. This actually shows one of the early examples of computer printing, large format computer printing. This billboard would have been 14 by 48 feet, probably on a major highway, reaching a lot of people on their way home from work every day when they might be a little hungry. And in the past, up until the 90s, early 90s, these large format bulletins were not printed on paper. The smaller formats still were printed and glued on paper, just like these old buddies here. But the larger billboards, like 14 by 48 feet, were hand painted. It was a laborious process involving doing a large tracing of a blow up of the artwork would be shown or projected onto a piece of paper the size of the billboard, and there would be a tracing of the major outlines of different items in it and picking up colors and everything else, and eventually it would have been hand painted. This, as you can see, is a real photograph. So printing technology improved in the 80s and 90s. A lot of it driven actually in Israel. Just done a lot of printing stuff. And it's such that, eventually we had out-of-home ads put on the sides of buildings, one big piece of a substrate, kind of a plastic substrate that had been printed on a computer printer, put up on the side of the building, but looking appetizing, okay, just like that, whatever that is, all white meat chicken. Hey, this is out-of-home too, everybody. Gillette Fusion Razor. So they took the Zamboni machine and look what they did. But that's out of home. You're out of home and you're seeing it. It's out of home. Just like the Comcast, Bud Light, Lumber Liquidators, Bank North ads. But I would say maybe a little bit more effective in terms of communicating an actual benefit. Okay, fun idea. Out of home. And this is out of home too. It's electrified here. This looks like it's in, I think, probably an airport. So I show a lot of out-of-home because I've spent a lot of time in out-of-home, so I'm a little biased towards it. So anyway, hope you forgive me for that. So out-of-home, again, is now, a lot of it is electrified and digitized, and going from just a glued piece of paper to computer painted large format displays, and now to electronic displays, which allow a lot of things that were never possible before in out-of-home. Newspapers, as I said before, started early on in the colonies. A lot of political sentiment was communicated in newspapers. They tended to be very strongly for or against one candidate or another, or one politician or another, or one government or another. And these little local newspapers, such as the one Benjamin Franklin printed, were 2 sheets. That's it. Came out once a week. See, it's a weekly advertiser, so they ran some ads. They had content. Of course, the content from England came over on ships, so it was about 2 months old, any news you got. That's just the way it was. These were fairly expensive, so this is kind of a middle class to upper class thing. But there are lots of these little newspapers being printed and getting the word out one way or the other. Then the steam engine came into being, and I don't know if you know who that fellow is on the left. I hope you do, but that's Abraham Lincoln. When he's first in office, he's not as haggard and careworn as he becomes after 5 years or 4.5 years in office, which is all he had. Newspapers still ruled the roost here, and at this point they are multi-page because we've got steam-driven printers in different cities, and they come out once a day, not once a week, and they're full of advertising, full of content. And by the way, European content, because of the laying of telegraph wires not too long before this, telegraph wires across under the ocean, European content got to the United States pretty darn fast. Interestingly, you didn't buy TV, you didn't buy any advertising in those days. Politicians did not buy advertising, I should say. Products and companies did, but not politicians. Politicians didn't even campaign in those days. So Lincoln, when he won the Republican nomination in 1860, went back to his home and just received visitors and did a lot of, machinations behind closed doors. Who's going to be on what cabinet, who's going to do this, who's going to do that. And of course, the country was on the verge of civil war, slavery being an intensely hot issue at this point. That's an understatement. So Lincoln is in fact elected to the presidency, and the way he communicated while he was running for the presidency, although he didn't campaign, but he communicated by using newspapers, as he did when he was president. So he would send a letter to the editor or the publisher of a major newspaper, like the New York Tribune. The publisher was a fellow named Horace Greeley. It was a very famous publisher. And Greeley would publish the president's letter, and the president would make some statement about policy or something he believed in the letter. And then this letter would be picked up by newspapers all across the country and reprinted. And in this way, Lincoln or other politicians were able to reach the masses of the people that they were representing. Newspapers were it. Okay, we're it. And nothing much new happened with newspapers until a guy by the name of Al Newharth was running the Gannett company I actually worked at for 10 years. And he got the idea. He came from the newspaper business to try to revitalize newspapers, and take back some of the magic that television and broadcast had taken away from newspapers. So he launched the country's first national newspaper. It was in color. Printing was done. Content was sent out by satellite to different printing centers across the country. And he started off, very vitally. I think at the most they had maybe 5 or 6 million circulation, which is a lot in that business. And I think even now they're down to about 2.5 or 3 million circulation. So it's still in business. And it was an attempt to kind of revive newspapers. Now, today, as we mentioned before, and I've mentioned at least, probably a couple of times, newspapers have had a hard time of it, as have all printed media, as electronic media have come to the fore. Jeff Bezos, I'm sure you've heard that name, bought the Washington Post several years ago. And he is the Amazonian warrior who now owns the Washington Post. So they will go on publishing, of course. And now he owns the newspaper that's the best read newspaper in the city of Washington. And arguably an entity that has some influence on people's opinions in Washington and in other places. So newspapers, they digitize, they have websites, whether they're big city papers, national papers, arguably like the Wall Street Journal or the USA Today, or they're local suburban papers. A lot of you may have a weekly suburban paper. Some papers are still kind of clinging on, okay, one way or another, so all power to them. What kind of content do we get from newspapers? A lot of it's information, right? Magazine supposedly comes from the Arabic word, I'll say this wrong, I'm sure, magazine, which means storehouse, which means there's just a lot of good goodies in here, okay? This is from a long time ago, 1909. Scribner's Magazine was an early one. And so these things would come out, price 25 cents. This is October. This one was coming out once a month. So once a month was pretty common. But you have color photographs, you have stories, articles, you have entertainment and information, you have text, you have pictures, you have ads. And this was just a great way for someone to spend, as I think I said before, some leisure time. You weren't watching a lot of movies at that point. No TV to watch, but you could curl up with your magazine and poke around in it and, keep it by your bed and read yourself to sleep every night, etc. Here's another one jumping ahead to the 40s. Saturday Evening Post was another, I want to say it's weekly, August 24th, 1940. I think it became weekly. So this is about to become World War II, right, everybody? December of 1940, December 7th. The U.S. was attacked in Pearl Harbor. So this is right before the beginning of World War II. Now, you'll notice the artist down there at the bottom. You can see the name Norman Rockwell. I don't know how many of you have heard of him. Very, very famous illustrator and artist. And he actually would have posed this exact picture in real life with this girl looking like this and all these other things. And then he would paint it. He's regarded as kind of the Americana painter. And I know there are some people, wealthy Hollywood people and others, who collect his stuff today and pay a lot for it. There's a museum of his work up in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, which is where he lived. And now today, magazines still hanging in, just like newspapers. They've been battered and beaten and lost circulation, lost advertisers. But you still particularly have these special interest publications like this one. People still want to get their fresher, and if you're advertising in it, it's a cool place to advertise. It rubs off on you that you're pretty cool if you're advertising in Slasher, etc. And of course, we have the online editions. This is a magazine called New York Magazine that started, I think, in the 60s. Very famous, influential magazine. I think the guy